All right, how's it going, y'all? So today we're going to be going over a complete UniFi setup right here. So this is going to be assuming you've got like a Dream Machine or any of their similar equipment, and this is going to go over setting it up from scratch. We're going to touch on very briefly at the beginning here what these three components are and what they do. So we will be having chapter markers below because if you already have your equipment and kind of already know how you're set up, you go ahead and skip to those. But we're going to start by just kind of going over what these three pieces are and how you can use them, as well as what different options there are pretty briefly at the beginning here. And then we're going to go all the way into setting up this Dream Machine Pro Max, all the way till we have Wi-Fi running and even a guest network up and running without going too in depth to keep this short. And then UniFi has a ton of features. There is a ton you can do with these systems. And so I'm going to talk briefly about the most common things I do with them and what other options there are. But this video is going to be everything you need to get started and actually get up and running. And if you like these videos, I'm planning on doing a fair amount more of them. So go ahead and put any suggestions you've got for me down in the comments below and subscribe. We're trying to hit 100,000 subscribers and we've got a lot more UniFi content coming on out. All right. So to start off, let's talk about what these three things are. And so at the very bottom right here, I've got a Dream Machine Pro Max. And for most people, it will really do three specific things. First off, it is a router or a firewall. Those two are more or less interchangeable terms. Technically, as you go larger, they are completely separate units. But for most medium-sized businesses, a router and a firewall are essentially the same thing. And what they do is they take a public IP address and they create a local network behind them or multiple local networks behind them. And so most people have a Wi-Fi router at their house. That's actually all three of these things in one. But routing in and of itself is just the act of essentially taking one public IP address and creating an entire network behind it, as well as saying what can and cannot come in. And so this is used to protect your network and can actually be used to block threatening traffic. And so if somebody goes to a bad site with a known bad IP address that may be trying to deploy malicious code, this can actually sever that connection and just not let those packets in at all. And so it is going to be basically what runs our network. And so the next thing this also is a UniFi application server or UniFi console. Essentially what this is it runs all of the devices, all the UniFi devices on your network. So these are two independent UniFi devices on top of it, a switch and a Wi-Fi access point. And it is going to essentially aggregate all that information and have one pane of glass to control all of it. And so it actually controls everything and gets metrics on, hey, which ports are running fastest and things like that. Now, the last thing that it does in a lot of people's cases is actually act as a NVR or a network video recorder. So we're actually not going to be deploying this in this case, but these things have built-in hard drive bays up front to actually have security cameras that can record to them. UniFi has a massive line of security cameras and they work very well. And they're a great bang for your buck, especially if you only need to deploy maybe 4 or 5 of them. Something like this is a great setup because you can have it all in one place and not have to have a separate NVR and just record directly to your router. And so that's what this is. It's really 3 applications in one. You could split them off, but in general, it's a great place to start. And they also sell ones that include Wi-Fi, such as the just standard Dream Machine. And so that is where if you didn't want to have a separate Wi-Fi access point or one at all. This is also rack mountable, which is very nice. And so mine that's in my rack behind me is nice and rack mounted, and it really controls the whole network. All right, so that is what a Dream Machine is. They can do a ton, and there's a lot of different versions of them. Next up, what we've got up here is a switch. This is actually one of their ether lighting PoE switches. So this is the Pro Max 16, and it's got ether lighting, so I'm gonna show that later. Basically, it can light up different ports. It's very fun, but more importantly, it does a few things here. It is actually a PoE switch. And what PoE is power over Ethernet. And so this not only gives devices hooked up to it Ethernet, it also can give them power, which is what we're going to be using in this case right here. So this is a Wi-Fi access point that generally you need to have both power and Ethernet to it. But instead, they use what's called power over Ethernet. And so this switch actually just supplies both Ethernet and power to our Wi-Fi access point. So we only have one cable having to go to it, and it is very useful. PoE switches can be used to power a ton of different things, but the most common things you'll see are really 3 of them. You'll see Wi-Fi access points, phones, and security cameras are by far the most common things you see being PoE powered. but there's tons of other options you can do. And you can even have like an iPad being PoE powered with the right adapter. And so the switch essentially takes in the network connection from the router and allows everybody else to talk. It's not really in control of the network, but rather it just spreads out the network and lets more devices talk. Anything that's plugged in the switch that is on the same network can pretty much directly talk to each other, increasing speed. This one has 2 different speed of ports, and that is how fast the 2 different devices can talk to each other if they've got it. Most of the ports are 1 gigabit, but on the far left-hand side, they have 2.5 gigabit ports, which is very useful for these faster Wi-Fi access points, or even having a NAS hooked up. And then on the very farthest left, those 2 weird ports are what's called SFP plus, or 10 gigabit fiber optic cables. And so the switch essentially is just there to allow everybody to talk and communicate, and it also can help us segregate out our network. And it's also going to be powering our PoE access points, which are Wi-Fi access points, as well as any cameras we add in as well. Finally, we have an access point. This is, as I said earlier, a power over Ethernet access point. And so what this is Wi-Fi. It is not a Wi-Fi router, because if you just plug this into your charter modem, it wouldn't do anything. Instead, it is just an access point. So it takes all the commands from the Dream machine below it, and it is told, hey, this is how you set up the Wi-Fi, this is your IP address, this is how you do everything, and that is all it does. And so you can have multiple of these, and as you're walking around the house, your phone will hop between them based off of what has the best signal at that time. And there's a ton of stuff you can do it. This right here is one that is ceiling mounted, but you can get them in pretty much any size, shape, and form that you need with different speeds. As you can see, it's just being powered with a single cable. And so if you have a switch that does not support power over Ethernet, you have to buy what's called a PoE injector, which will basically go between it and the switch to just give it power. So you plug it into an AC outlet, plug it into the switch, and plug it into the access point, and this PoE injector will inject power over Ethernet into that cable so that it is nicely powered. And so those are our 3 things that we've got here. There's a whole bunch more custom configuration you can do and a whole bunch more stuff, but this is really like the base 3 components. Then if you see this big blue cable right here, that is my WAN connection. And so this is what you would plug into your Charter Spectrum modem or your AT&T router. Basically, that is the WAN cable that comes in and gives internet. And if you look, there is a port on there that is labeled WAN on the Dream machine. And what that does is that is the outside network. And then all the other ports are the inside network. That's the LAN. And so that's what I've done. I've just hooked it up in there. And then if you see this thin blue cable, it is going to be hooked up to my laptop. And I've just got an easy adapter on it right here. And so that way we can set up all of this directly and have a really easy hookup to it. All right, so now let's go ahead and get started. If we wanted to, these can actually be set up over Bluetooth. So if you don't have a built-in Ethernet adapter where you can use that, you can actually just set up on your phone and set up your Wi-Fi via that. But so y'all can see it really easily, I'm just gonna go ahead and plug my laptop directly into the UDM. All right, so now the very first time you set this thing on up, we should be getting a 192.168.1 IP address from the UDM. And the way we can verify that is all we do is we go to 192.168.1.1. And if you see this connection is not private, you know you're in the right place. This is actually totally secure. Anytime you put in a local IP address in a browser window, you'll never get a "this is secure" message. And so we're gonna go ahead and say show details and continue. Firefox, Chrome, and Safari all have different versions of this, so you just need to figure out how to click through and join it. And just like that, we have found it. And now we're gonna go through and do the first time setup guide for the Dream Machine Pro Max. And this is really going to be the heart of our entire network that runs everything. So I'm just gonna create one called SpaceRex Demo. You can name this whatever. And so now you can actually hook this up to a UniFi account and follow this through, or you can proceed to just have a local connection. If you want to be able to do these settings remotely or have a remote backup, you can sign in with a UniFi account. And I'm going to go ahead and sign in with mine as well to show how that backup process works. But if not, they do allow you to set this up locally. So I'm just going to go ahead and sign in with my account here. That's going to get all blurred. And in my case, I actually just formatted this thing, so it's actually asking me to restore from backup, but we're just going to say continue without backup to set this thing up new. Right here, this is where we could set up really easily as a NVR to actually record footage, but we're just going to go ahead and skip that. And now, right off the bat, it's going to go ahead and test my download and my upload speed. And as you can see, we've got very nice internet speeds here. And now, it's just going to go ahead and do the basic setups right there. If you've been looking, there's a little screen on it that tells us exactly what it's doing. And it is essentially just doing our first time install. Now, the very first thing we should always do whenever we set up a network like this is, by default, it has set us up with a subnet that is 192.168.1. And you want to change this. This is the first thing you should change every time you set up a new router, is never have it on 192.168.1. Honestly, I just avoid the 192.168 network entirely. And instead, I always set up stuff on the 10 dot networks. There's way more of them and nobody else uses them. And so you have the ability to customize your subnet however you like to. And the reason you really want to do this is you want to make it so that when you inevitably set up a VPN, or maybe you want to connect your work and your house together, you want everything to be on different subnets to make it very clear about who can talk to who. And I'm not going to go super in depth with what subnets are, but we're going to go ahead and just say anything that is on the same subnet generally can talk. It's generally on the same local network. We're just going to go ahead and show you how to change it on over. And so the first thing we're going to hop into before we do a single other thing is to come in here and change our gateway IP. And so to do this, we're going to come in over here. We're going to go to settings, network, and we are going to change the default network subnet. And note, when you do this, everything else is going to shut down and have to be reset. And so that's why I've not adopted anything yet, because we're going to redo everything and we're just going to power cycle all this stuff afterwards. And we're also going to have to pull the Ethernet cable out of my laptop and plug it back in. So as I said earlier, we are on that 192.168.1 network. Horrible idea. Stay off that because you want to be able to VPN in later on and do a whole bunch of fun stuff. So we're just going to change our default network to 10 dot anything between 0 and 254. So whenever I'm setting up a network, I basically give it a 10 dot something number, and then all the networks within there are going to be in that same subnet. We're going to start very, very, very basic here, not really go super in depth with that. But I want you to basically pick a fun number in between 0 and 254. Realistically, 1 and 254, just to decrease the chance of overhead. And so in this case, we're going to do 70. We're going to do 10.70.0.1. Now, you can use that. I'm going to choose 0 as my third octet, because that way I can use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for all my different VLANs, and we're going to talk about that all later. Now, one last thing to know is make sure you always start with 10 if you're going to do this, or use the other local networks, because anything that starts with 10 with an IP address space is guaranteed to only be a local IP address, so you won't mess up the internet. I've actually had clients who had set up like that, where it was an 11, and essentially they could not access random internet sites who had that IP address. So you're always safe whenever you start with a 10 or a 192.168. So this is a great place to start, and you can customize this however you like to, but if you want to use 10.70, that's totally fine too. And we're just going to hit apply changes. When we do this, we are going to lose internet access, and this connection's no longer going to work. Because now the UDM is no longer living at 192.168.1.1, and instead we'll be living at 10.70.0.1. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to unplug the Ethernet cable from my laptop and plug it back in. And that will tell my laptop to get a new IP address. Then I'm going to reset these guys right here and essentially do the same thing by unplugging power. All I've got to do is unplug power from the switch because it's also powering the Wi-Fi access point, and just plugging it back in. By doing this, everything will re-request an IP address from the UDM. So now I'm just going to go to that 10.70, 10.70.0.1. And just like that, I can go ahead and log in again. And this is the new location of my dream machine. So that is the most important thing to do when you start out. Always, always, always change that subnet. I've seen other tutorials that say it's because hackers know you're using 192.168.1. That's dumb. Really, it is because you want to be able to customize your subnets and use site-to-site VPNs and VPNs, where if you've got overlapping numbers, weird stuff happens, it gets very complicated. So always the first thing you do should be to change that. And if you're setting up a business and your house, make sure they're not the same numbers. So that way later on, if you want, they can actually talk and do some really cool stuff. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and just enable our auto updates. And honestly, for the longest time, I did not have UniFi stuff on auto update. And then they've not had a real issue in the last 2 years. So I'm now on auto update train. I would recommend keeping it to official. And we're going to go ahead and just hit update on our network. As I said earlier, we can also install Protect right here, as well as a bunch of other applications that UniFi can do. And so that is all going to be for another tutorial. This unit can also do a really cool thing called shadow mode. I'll leave a link down to my tutorial on that, but it essentially gives you high availability where you can fail over from one to the other. So if your router fails, it doesn't take out your whole network. While we're in here and waiting for our network to update, we're gonna go into our console settings, and we wanna make sure that we've got an automatic backup. And right here, it's set up automatically for weekly, and that is perfect. And here, if you want to, you can actually disable remote access entirely. We're not gonna do that because honestly, it helps a lot with configuration. There's a lot of great stuff I can do. But if your compliance requirements require only local access to a router, which some of them do, that is where you would do that. All right, so now we should be back on in and we can see that our network has updated. So we're just gonna go ahead and see that we are running 8.2.93. And we're gonna go ahead and click on it and we should see everything we've got here. So now I actually wanna give a bit of a demo on everything. You'll see that my WAN IP is 10.30. That is not a public IP address, as I said earlier. That's because I'm actually hooked this up to my router itself. And so that way I can do this without exposing my public IP address and just have a little demo LAN. You can also already see all the stuff that's coming through the network because the Dream Machine is actively checking what sites things are going to. All right, so now let's go ahead and let's adopt our devices. So we're gonna go into our UniFi devices right here, and we're going to see that our switch and our access point are both ready to adopt. And all we have to do is click adopt on them. Adopting essentially takes control of the device and allows it in this dashboard. So we're going to adopt both of these guys right here, and that's gonna take a minute. It's gonna go through and do their updates and all that stuff. And that way, all these devices that you've got are just controlled on one pane of glass right here. Now, I'm in wired Ethernet right now, so we don't have to have Wi-Fi set up, but we are also going to want to set up Wi-Fi. So to do that, we're going to go into settings and Wi-Fi. And this is probably the very first thing you want to do, so that way you can stop being on wired Ethernet and actually go use Wi-Fi. Now, one other thing to note, if you are doing this on your phone via Bluetooth, you will have had to do this earlier on. So now we just go ahead and name our Wi-Fi. This is going to be the SSID, or what shows up on the side, and go ahead and come up with a fun password. Now, there are a ton of options here for customizing your Wi-Fi. If you're a business and you want to do a hotspot, they've got this hotspot portal. You can choose what bands to operate on, which also includes the new 6 GHz Wi-Fi 6E and 7 spectrums. Band steering, generally leave on. That'll tell devices, hey, use 5 GHz, don't use 2.5 GHz. Client device isolation actually allows you to essentially have devices that are hooked up to Wi-Fi not be able to talk to anybody else. And this is really useful for whenever you're setting up like a guest Wi-Fi or an IoT network, depending on what you need. BSS transition frame, this should be the very first thing you disable if you're having any weird issues. So if you've got an old device that just does not want to stay connected to Wi-Fi very well, disable this. And another really cool thing you can do is for those devices that are really awkward and slow and have problems, you can actually create an entirely separate Wi-Fi network that actually has all the settings configured for these weird devices that don't need that much speed, and instead making this really fast. Then I always like enabling fast roaming, as well as getting Matter devices multicast enhancement can really help with Matter devices. And so that is the basics here for getting started. There's a whole bunch of options, and this is our first Wi-Fi network. Future ones can also be set to different networks. And so we're going to talk through creating a guest network as well. All right, so now that we've set up our Wi-Fi, we should be able to go back into our devices over here, and we should see that our device have updated. Well, they've not quite adopted just yet. Our PoE switch had to reboot as part of the update process, and it took out our network. So we're just going to go ahead and wait for that to come up. And then we should be able to start connecting our devices to Wi-Fi. And as you can see, the ether lighting is very fun. All right, great. So now all of our devices have been adopted. And so now we can manage them, we can see what's going on. And we actually even get this great topology graph that shows what everything's hooked up to. So we can see exactly what you see in front of you. Here is my router right here, that's the Dream machine. And then my laptop's plugged into it, and the switch is plugged into it. And then the PoE access point is plugged into that. And so it gives you a very nice diagram. You can also come in here and actually see everything. You can look at your port speeds. There's a ton of stuff you can do here. You can even power cycle specific devices. That's one of the really nice things about Power over Ethernet is it controls the power. So if you've got a device acting up or anything like that, you can just click on it and hit power cycle. And just like that, it turns off. It turns the device off because it's essentially just unplugging the power and plugging it back in. And so there's a ton of really useful stuff you can do here. And now we want to go in and set up our really basic security settings for this. So we want to use some of the really nice threat monitoring and threat detection that UniFi has built in. And it makes it just really easy to set up, configure, and even be able to see what's going on. And so that is all under this security tab right here. So the ones I use a lot of time is DNS Shield. This will basically encrypt your traffic before it ever leaves the network, specifically your DNS lookups, which traditionally actually happen unencrypted. And so this is a good way of making sure your ISP does not know what website names you're going to. The ISP will always be able to tell what websites you go to based off their IP address, if they wanted to, unless you're using a privacy VPN, and a honeypot. Honeypots are very useful because they can allow you to figure out if something's in your network looking around, trying to find stuff. And so essentially what this is this is a ghost device on the network that if it gets pinged or has a port scan on it, it will alert you. And that way you can kind of tell if somebody's scanning ranges, trying to see what devices are open, which may make you think, hey, there might be a virus or something like that. So it's useful to have a honeypot, and it just needs to be outside the DHCP range. Then the next and probably the most valuable side is going to be under internet safety. This is one of my favorite features on this, and I always go to advanced, notify and block, and high. You can also customize everything under the sun you like here, but this actually uses Suricata to go through and do threat detection and threat monitoring, and can actually block malicious IP addresses or known exploits to see, hey, if somebody clicks a bad link, your router can actually kill that connection before anything ever happens. It is super useful to have, and UniFi makes it incredibly easy to set up and use. You can choose what networks to run on, and you can choose between notify or notify and block. Notify and block is supposed to be a little bit slower, but honestly, these things are really fast, so I've never seen a big issue. And you can see all the devices over here that you want to. And what I normally do for people is I will start with the most strict setups. And then as you find stuff that is false positives, or hey, I know this is kind of sketchy, but I'm doing it anyway and I trust it, you can either come in here and whitelist them, remove these out entirely, or also just go ahead and they've got an option to say, hey, let's allow this traffic in the future. So that's a great place to start. And dark web blocker will block any Tor addresses. So if you're running a Tor node or you want to use something like Tor browser, you have to uncheck that. And then malicious IP addresses, I always leave on. And this right here is your allow list for security detections. So if you've got one device that you just want to expose to the internet without any kind of protection, you can do that here as well. This is super useful and just can block a lot of stuff out of your network from ever even getting into the network. Country restrictions, it's up to you. I very rarely ever use that. And if you're going to use it, I do not recommend blocking both directions or outgoing and only blocking incoming, because outgoing can wreck websites. So I've had clients who like block it to Germany, and there's a server hosted in Germany that now they can't access. And so if you're doing that, be very, very, very tight with those. And in general, if you can, only block incoming. I personally don't find that too useful unless you've got a specific use case for it. Now, ACL rules and traffic and firewall rules, we're not going to touch over right now because there is so much stuff to do there. We really just want to keep the very basics on this. But this is where you can customize everything and create IoT networks, create specific VLANs, and have all these rules about what can talk to what and how. So I'm going to leave that for another day, but these basic settings are a great place to start for protection, and you'll also start seeing triggers and you can start acting upon them. VPN, Teleport is actually awesome. It works really well. They finally got macOS clients working okay, and it just allows you a one-touch VPN to set up. But there's also this VPN server, which can allow you to run WireGuard or OpenVPN, and that works great. And it's really useful for getting remote access to your network and being able to access things securely from outside the local network. WireGuard is great for that. It does take a little bit of configuration. And OpenVPN you can set up where you've got multiple usernames and passwords. All this is very easy. Finally, there is also site-to-site VPN and VPN client. VPN client is if you want a privacy VPN. Site-to-site VPN is if you want two devices to talk, though if they're both UniFi, check out SiteMagic. It works so easily. But if you want to hook this up to like a AWS server or maybe even a pfSense box at another site, you can do that with IPsec or OpenVPN. All right, so now we have the basic setup of our network. We should be able to turn on Wi-Fi now, and we should see that Wi-Fi SSID that we created. So right here, we can see SpaceRex demo. We can just go ahead and put in our password. And now we are hooked on in. So now we should be able to go ahead and actually see who's hooked up to what and how they're hooked up. So we can see right here that my MacBook right here has two different connections. One of them is via Wi-Fi and one of them is via wired Ethernet. So one device can be hooked up multiple ways depending on the different connections. And so now those are our basics. We've got our network set up. The next thing we want to do is just let's set up a guest network. And this can also double as a basic IoT network for something like a Roomba that just needs internet access. We're going to go over that in future tutorials for even more in-depth options. But starting out, we're just going to keep it nice and simple and set up a basic guest network. And so we're going to do this in two different ways. We're first going to create the VLAN, which is basically the network. It is a virtual LAN, and that is where you can allow or restrict things from talking to each other. And we do that under the network. And this is where we can create it in the subnet or in a different subnet. So let's go ahead and put this on the 10.70.50 subnet. So we're going to go ahead and create new virtual network, and we're going to call this guest. Choose our router as the UDM. I guess the UDM Pro Max now. And we are going to go ahead and give it that subnet that we choose. We're going to go ahead and choose 10.70.50.1. And so that way it is a different subnet than our main LAN. And that way traffic is all segregated out based off of that. Now we can go ahead and assign it a VLAN ID. I normally do something like 750 for that kind of thing, but automatic is always fine, so whatever's there. If you're only using UniFi devices, then you don't have to choose a VLAN ID. It takes care of it all for you. And now we can do our very basic settings here where we can say it's a guest network, which means it's going to be isolated out. So it's essentially going to go ahead and not let it talk to any other devices, and they are only going to be able to communicate with each other and the internet. You can also create a hotspot right here. So this is a very easy way of just creating a network, and it's basically going to be restricted on out. We've created the network. Now we need to create the Wi-Fi to go along with it. So I'm going to go ahead and create SpaceRex guest. And when we're choosing our network, Instead of putting it on default, we're going to put it on guest. So we can create a hotspot portal and a whole bunch of stuff, but we can also just leave it on straight auto. So now let's go ahead and make sure that this thing actually works. So let's go in, and what we want to happen is we want our guest network to not have the ability to talk to anything other than the internet, which is the most secure way of doing it. So I'm going to go down and we should see our spacerex-guest. And so now, just like that, we've got our basic login. And if we try to go to the router, we can't. So it will not let us talk to the router and do any settings, but we can go to the internet, which is exactly what you want. So now any devices on there cannot talk to anything but the internet, which is very useful. You can also choose, instead of creating as a guest network, and I'm going to hop back into our main one where we can talk to the router, you can also change this network from being a guest network to something a little bit more basic, where it's a isolated network. And so by isolating out stuff from this network, essentially you can choose to not let it talk to anything else. And that way it can still hit the router, which is not too big of a deal because these can be publicly exposed. And we can also include firewall rules to limit that. But you don't have to have things like a hotspot portal or anything like that to actually log in. And so isolate network can be really useful for just spinning up a quick and easy IoT network, where essentially, if you look, it creates a firewall rule that says, hey, anything that is on that 10.70.50 network, that was that one that we created that is for that guest network, that's trying to go to anything else, drop it. And so that is how that works. And so I'm on the guest network now. And if I try to ping the router, it'll let me. But if I try to ping that switch, it will not. But if I switch back over to that main network, it will let me. Well, once it joins back in properly. And so that is the difference between the hotspot and the guest network. All right, so now we pretty much have the basics of our system set up. There's a whole lot of stuff you can do with playing with the Wi-Fi, playing with your subnets, playing with your VLANs, tons of stuff, but this is a pretty good stopping place for setting everything on up. Go ahead and leave any other tutorials you'd like to see me making this in the comments below. I'm planning on doing a big old push with this just because finally UniFi's gotten a very stable setup and it doesn't change that often. And so it's really easy to make tutorials in it now that'll actually last more than 6 months. And so there's a ton of stuff here. And so go ahead and leave those down in the comments below and have a good one. Bye.